that sermon bumper because that is my favorite one because I'm an old Clint Eastwood fan, and I think it's kind of fitting though, right? We've got straw and hay or whatever that is on the stage and lamekins and dogs and whatever that is over there. I don't know. I guess we'll find out. But welcome to this last message in the series, Run with the Horses. Really enjoyed studying the life of Jeremiah. And I think it's fitting. The Kentucky Derby was ran earlier this month. It's considered the most exciting 2 minutes in sports. And this year's Kentucky Derby was awesome. And so I've got a clip that I want to show of that ties into the message. At least I think it ties into the message. And so if we could roll that clip of the ending of the Kentucky Derby. And so Golden Tempo, wasn't that amazing? I mean, to think about how he moved out from the pack and came out of the crowd and ran from last place to finish that race first and finished beside his brother. And so it was just so cool. And so like what we see here is Golden Tempo, he had to get out of the crowd. He had to get out of the crowd to finish first. And a lot of times this is how it looks like in our life. Like we have to get out of the crowd because crowds are powerful. Crowds normalize compromise, right? Crowds reward conformity. Crowds make us make wrong feel right and make us stop questioning what people are saying or thinking. And so Jeremiah lived in a culture exactly like that. Jeremiah was preaching God's morality to a people who had collapsed morally. And so his culture is a lot like our culture, was crowded with idols, crowded with corruption, crowded with compromise, crowded with people who said they knew God but really didn't obey God. They ignored his messenger and his message. And so Jeremiah's message was that his message to us is don't let the crowd disciple you. Don't let the world around you disciple you. Let Jesus, his words, and his people be your disciplers. And so the crowd always pressures for conformity. Always pressures for conformity. Some modern day examples of this would be actor Chris Pratt. He has been open about his faith since he was a teenager, and it has drawn a lot of criticism. And he's actually, been affected by that, and then, has gone kind of back and forth. But he's faced all kinds of people to cancel his career over that. Another example of this would be Tim Tebow, when he would wear the blackened patch that the football players wear, John 3:16, and they said, you got to take that off. And he's like, I'm not compromising. No, Jesus is the way. But there was this a pressure for him to compromise his faith. And so the compromise creep, I call it, the compromising creep, or the compromising creeper that's in our culture today, is trying to force people to redefine what marriage is, or redefine what sexuality is, or redefine what gender means, or redefine what right and wrong is. We live in a postmodern culture where truth is relative, and you define your right and you define your wrong, and we say no. The source of truth, the source of right and wrong comes from the Lord himself, not from people, right? And so the crowd, you see, the crowd doesn't usually demand rebellion from God overnight. It's gradual. It's just a slow fade, if you will. But a collapsing culture is never an excuse for a collapsing character. And so God never called his people to fit into the crowd. He called them to stand faithfully within it. To stand faithfully within it. And Jeremiah is a person who did just that. Jeremiah didn't give up trying to reach his fellow Israelites. And Jeremiah, this is one of my favorite stories in the book of Jeremiah, the story of the Rechabites. And so what Jeremiah is going to do is he's going to make a very vivid illustration of a group of people who did not compromise. And so what he does, he goes to the temple proper in Jerusalem, and he rents a banquet room. And it's a room where people can see who's in there. It's not hidden off. It's an open room where people can see what's going on inside of there. And he lays out a big table of food and wine. And he has this group of people come and sit at the banquet table. Now, the group that he invites, the Rechabites, they are a group from the ancient Near East who are this fascinating community of nomadic culture. The Rechabites, they show up in Jerusalem one day, mainly because the Babylonian Empire is encroaching further and further down upon Jerusalem. And they're a guild of nomadic metal workers, which is another reason I like them. You know, I like metal stuff. I like burning things and banging on things, you know. Anyway, if you know what I'm talking about, you know what I'm talking about. But anyway, they roamed the country. They didn't live in a city. They lived in tents. And so they would go from town to town. And if you had a javelin broke or a wagon wheel broke or a plow broke, you'd set it aside and you'd wait for the Rechabites to show up, and with their amazing skills as a metal worker, they would repair whatever you had. Now, they trace their history back 250 years in this moment in their life, much like our country, 250 years old. They had a long history, and it goes back to Rechab, who was living during the time of Jehu. So, a while back, this is where all their tribe started, from this one descendant, this one guy. And their trade secrets of working the metal were very important. And so that's why they didn't drink wine. Because like the old adage, you know, loose lips sink ships. So they were like, these are trade secrets. I had a great-grandfather, Grandpa McHugh, I called him. And he was the only guy in Middle Illinois who could weld cast iron. So he was always fixing the blocks of tractors and that kind of thing. And he would literally hide how he did it, because if everyone knew how to do it, then he wouldn't have a business, you see. And so these were trade secrets that the Rechabites had. And what Jeremiah is going to do, he's going to take this group of people who are not part of the crowd to be an illustration to the crowd of how to live faithful. And so, as I said, this banquet table is set out. There's all kinds of food and wine on there. And Jeremiah invites them in to sit down, and we'll pick it up in Jeremiah chapter 35, verse 5. He says, I set cups and jugs of wine before them and invited them to have a drink, but they refused. No, they said, we don't drink wine, because our ancestor, Jonadab, son of Rechab, gave us this command: you and your descendants must never drink wine. And do not build houses or plant crops or vineyards. Always live in tents. If you follow these commands, you will live long, good lives in the land. So we have obeyed him in all these things. So get this. Here's this group sitting at this big table. And then these leading priests who have compromised their faith are watching all this go down. And so Jeremiah is trying to make this vivid illustration of what it means to be faithful in the crowd, right? And then Jeremiah turns to these spectators, these people who are about up to here with Jeremiah. They're kind of sick of all his illustrations, which if you read the book of Jeremiah, you'll see there are a lot of illustrations that he tries to use. But at least he didn't preach naked like Ezekiel, so there's that. But anyway, all these onlookers are looking at him, and he says, this is what the Lord of heaven armies says, the God of Israel says, go to the people in Judah and Jerusalem, come and learn a lesson on how to obey me. The Rechabites do not drink wine to this day because of their ancestor Jonadab told them not to. But I have spoken to you again and again, and you refuse to obey me. Time after time I sent prophets who told you, turn from your wicked ways and start doing things right. Stop worshiping other gods so that you might live in peace here in the land I have given to you and your ancestors. Because you refuse to listen or answer when I call, I will send upon Judah and Jerusalem all the disasters I have threatened. Then Jeremiah turned to the Rechabites and said this is what the Lord of heaven armies, the God of Israel, says. You have obeyed your ancestor Jonadab in every respect, following all his instructions. Therefore, this is what the Lord of heaven armies, the God of Israel, says. Jonadab, son of Rechab, will always have descendants who serve me. And so here's this plays out, and the people of Jerusalem have drifted far away from their moorings of following the Lord. They had normalized compromise because of the pull of the crowds around them. But the Rechabites, they're living in Jerusalem and they're not compromising. They are maintaining their integrity even before the crowd. And so the Rechabites, they disciplined themselves differently than the rest of the people. They resisted this cultural absorption. They maintained a generational conviction. Over generations, they remained faithful. Not because the rules saved them, but because faithfulness mattered to their identity. And so this isn't about a specific choices of lifestyle. This isn't about the drinking of wine or being a metal worker or never living in a house. It's not about that. The issue here is steadfast obedience. This is what Jeremiah is trying to show the people of Israel. And so the Rechabites, they're an uncrowded people in a crowded culture. And so we're going to look at a few lessons that they present to us. One is integrity is proven under crowd pressure. So Jeremiah 35 is fascinating because they're tested. The Rechabites are tested publicly. And so Jeremiah sets these jugs and cups of wine, right? Now, you got to understand also what's going on in the context of this passage. As I said, the Babylonian Empire is encroaching on Jerusalem. Destruction's coming. It's coming rapidly and quickly. And so food is in short supply. Wine is in short supply. All kinds of needed things are drying up, if you will. And so this pressure to eat and drink is not a hypothetical thing. Like, it's a real deal. And so this pressure to cave is in front of everybody. And they refuse. The Rechabites refuse to cave in. Now, they could have said things like this. That's just one meal. It's just one meal. Look, there's famine in the land. It's just one meal. Or how about this one? We don't want to offend our host, Jeremiah. We don't want to offend him. He's a man of God. Man of God told me to do this. They don't do that. Or they didn't say this. Times have changed. They didn't say that. Or they didn't say this. Well, everybody's drinking. So they didn't use any of those excuses. And so this temptation is put in front of them, but their integrity held. And God honors them publicly. And so in this collapsing nation, God still sees faithful people. God still sees the faithful. And you might think, well, does God care? Yes. God sees faithfulness, and he honors that. And so imagine a student sitting in a classroom where everybody around them is sharing the answers, right? They're using, some kind of group chat or AI or some kind of shortcut, copied assignments, and they might even be ridiculed for not caving, into that temptation. They might even look foolish for refusing, but they're doing the right thing even though it will cost them something, because maintaining our integrity will often cost us something. Right? Now, the cost of not maintaining your integrity is even greater, but not talking about that. Another example of this would be Chick-fil-A, the Lord's Chicken, right? Because we all know it's the Lord's Chicken. But are they open on Sundays? No, they're not open on Sundays, which I wish they were many times. When I'm traveling somewhere on Sunday, I was like, I want the Lord's Chicken. Give me a Chick-fil-A. But they're not open on Sundays, and they've had immense pressure on them put from from their investors, like, if you open on Sunday, you know how your profits would increase? But have you noticed they're like one of the most profitable restaurants in that whole industry, and yet they're closed on the Lord's Day. And so they don't compromise, and they've been blessed by the Lord. Another lesson from the Rechabites is this, that generational faithfulness requires a community of mentors. So the Rechabites, they remained faithful over 250 years because the generations before them discipled them seriously. These values weren't passed down accidentally. They were modeled. They were taught. They were reinforced through their families and through the community they lived in. This same principle appears in Timothy, who was a Timothy of Paul. He was his young preacher Paul was mentoring. And Paul writes this about him. He says, I remember your genuine faith, for you share the faith that first filled your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice, and I know that the same faith continues strong in you. Timothy stood strong as a young believer because he had two generations that had poured into him. And this is why at Cornerstone, we place such a high value on our what we call our orange strategy. So let me explain that. So the light of the church represented in the yellow circle, and the love in the home represented. So when these two groups come together, the church and the home, color orange, all right, if you will. And so this is our strategy. So we're trying to work with parents, grandparents, guardians, and in discipling and their children, and we call it the orange strategy. And so when we are working alongside parents, grandparents, guardians, we're helping them to instill a deep and abiding faith in their children. And so that the next generation knows who Jesus is, knows the difference between right and wrong, knows what God has said. Like, this is so important. And I think it's the most important work on earth is to instill the faith of God in the next generation so that people might know. So this week at Vacation Bible School, we have adult volunteers and student leaders that are serving as mentors to our children. Never underestimate the impact of these moments. And some of the most important lessons are about faith and character and courage to do the right thing are taught right here in moments like this on Sunday morning, Wednesday night, VBS, Camp Pit, wherever it might be, where people who are intentionally talking to kids, talking to students, and trying to help them, have these convictions deep down in their heart. And so mentoring relationships are essential to stand faithful when the crowd around us wants us to compromise. And so Jeremiah and the Rechabites, they lived in the city, but they refused to let the city live in them. They're living among their people, but they're refusing to compromise. Now, there are temptations that we as Christians often feel. One of those temptations is, when we see the crowd doing whatever they do, we want to get on Face Blaster or Instabomb and, just like, let them have it, Well, I don't know what kind of good that actually does. I think it does really almost no good. But there might be a time to post things about truth of God. I'm not saying you should never do that. But sometimes we have the tendency to lash out against the darkness. We're going to attack the darkness. We're going to go after it. We're going to knock it down. That's kind of one of our responses. And then there's another response that's equally not helpful, and that is that we panic. And we want to build a bunker around ourselves and our family. And we're just going to hide here. We're going to not let any outsiders into our world. And we're going to bunker down and hunker down, and we're just not going to be part of any of the culture around us, right? That's the other response, and there might be another. But Jesus has called us to be a city on a hill, a light among the nations, a light to darkness. He's called us to live in the crowd faithfully. This is what Jeremiah and the Rechabites do. And so to uncrowd, you see, to do that is you got to have a strong connection to Jesus and a strong connection to the church. And I'll explain that a little bit more here in a moment. But we have to be a positive influence on the people around us who are trapped in darkness. And so the third lesson from this passage is we need convictions to guide us. So we need a community, but we also need convictions, right? And so these are just a few of the convictions that come out of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. So I'll read through those in case you can't read the screen. Here's a couple. Seek first the kingdom of God. Love your neighbor as yourself. Tell the truth. Forgive quickly. Do not lust. Keep your word. Love your enemies. Pray for those who mistreat you. Give without seeking applause. Pray sincerely. Don't worship possessions. Fear not, trust God. Treat others the way you want to be treated. Make disciples. That's just a few of Jesus' laws for his kingdom and his followers. Yep, Jesus gave laws. He's king, right? And so we live in a kingdom. And these are the expectations of citizens of that kingdom. And these convictions, when we know them and understand why he would say these things, we bury those deep within our heart. We study the word. We hide it in our heart so we might not sin against God. The convictions are guiding us. They're like a moral compass, if you will. There's a guy, Southern California insurance salesman named Steve Robecki, and he attended this large convention of his associates, and they brought in this motivational speaker to encourage and challenge all these people in the insurance business. And this speaker, this motivational speaker, widely known, he kept using the Lord's name in vain over and over again. He used it carelessly and mockingly. He kept using the Lord's name in vain. And Steve's sitting there as a believer and a Christian, and he comes to a point where he's had it. And so in this large convention center with thousands of people, Steve Robecki, he gets up on his chair and he says, "Leave Jesus out of it." And then he sits back down and the crowd went silent. And when the motivational speaker kind of gathered himself, he stopped using the Lord's name in vain through the rest of his talk, right? And after the talk was over, people lined up not to shake the hand of the motivational speaker, but to shake the hand of Steve Robecki, because he stood up on his convictions of not taking the Lord's name in vain. And so, sometimes when we stand up for what's right, people will celebrate that. They're like, "Man, I'm glad you made a stand. I'm glad you stood up," and they respect that, but not always. Not always. Sometimes they applaud you, and sometimes they want to kill you. It's what happened to Jesus. He stood up for what was right, and they hung him on a cross. Sometimes you'll get respect, and sometimes you'll be rejected. But Jesus told us this. He says, God blesses you when people mock you and persecute you and lie about you and say all sorts of evil things against you because you're my followers. Be happy about it. It's easy for you to say. Be very glad. A great reward awaits you in heaven. And remember, the ancient prophets were persecuted in the same way. You think Jesus was thinking about Jeremiah? Mm-hmm. He was thinking about all the prophets who stood for what is right and were murdered by God's people. And sometimes people who weren't God's people. But anyway, anybody can hold beliefs in private, but integrity is proven under pressure. When we stand for Jesus, our convictions that we live by, don't be surprised by pushback from the crowd. Just go on FaceBlaster or Instabomb and say, the Lord created family, one man for one woman for life, or say something like God created two sexes. In the beginning, there was man and woman. Just say something like that and see what happens. No, don't do that. Actually, that's a terrible idea. Yeah, don't destroy your life, right? What I'm saying is that many times the crowd just can't stand the truth. They just don't want to hear it. They despise it. And so this is why it's so important that we have a community, we have mentors, we have deep convictions, we know what we believe, why we believe it, because God never intended courageous faithfulness to become isolated faithfulness. He never intended us to walk this path alone. And so Jeremiah, he is unsuccessful in convincing Israel of their unfaithfulness by using the Rechabites as an illustration. Then Jeremiah, after they have continued to reject him, Jeremiah says, all right, here's what's going to happen. This city's going to be wiped out. So don't resist. Just go off to Babylon. You'll come back in 70 years. And they're like, no, we don't want to hear it. And so what happens is King Zedekiah, who was kind of a milquetoast king, he and his officials, they get tired of hearing Jeremiah, throw him in the cistern. So they throw him in a well, and he sinks down in the mud. And it looks like it's the end for Jeremiah. But Jeremiah had a friend. In comes the next character in our story, Ebed-Melech. And Ebed-Melech is a friend of Jeremiah and a believer of what Jeremiah is preaching. But Ebed-Melech, the Ethiopian, an important court official, heard that Jeremiah was in the cistern. At that time, the king was holding the court at the Benjamin gate. So Ebed-Melech rushed from the palace to speak with him. My lord the king, he said, these men have done an evil thing, a very evil thing, in putting Jeremiah the prophet into a cistern. He will soon die of hunger, for almost all the bread in the city is gone. And so while Jeremiah is sinking to his death, Ebed-Melech, he goes to the king, and the king says, okay, it's a bad idea to kill the king's prophet, and it is. And they go in the king's wardrobe, and they pull out some old clothes, and they make a rope, and he gets 70 men, and they throw this down to Jeremiah, who's drowning in this mud, this quagmire, and they pull him up out of safety. And here's the point. We all need an Ebed-Melech in our life. And I don't mean that you're just casually known by another believer, but that you're intimately known as a deep friend with other believers, that people can hear and know what you're going through. And so one of the reasons that we collapse to culture is because we're not tied into the Lord's community. We're not tied in to a strong group of believers. And so, if you feel like you're alone in the cistern, you need to have somebody in the outside, because it can feel very, very isolated when you're standing for what is right, when the world is collapsing around you. And so we need a community beside us. Faithfulness, our faithfulness is a very personal thing, but it's not meant to be solitary. Faithful people need faithful people. And so my question right here in this message is, do you belong? Do you have a close-knit group of people that know you? You can text, you can call when you're going through a difficult time. Believers who share your convictions, know your struggles, know what you're growing through. And so if you don't, then this is a step for you in the right direction to take action. So the preacher says download the church app. So download our app. And if you go to the bottom of the app, you'll see events. And all the groups, when they meet and where they meet, are listed on that events. And you can sign up. Or maybe you're like, man, I want to do a group with some other people. And we can talk about that. But my point is that you're not meant to be faithful in isolation. You're meant to live in a community of other believers. The Rechabites, their convictions were strengthened because they lived in community, and it was modeled for them continuously. And that's why attending church casually is not an option in the kingdom of God. Your attendance here and with others is critical to another person's faithfulness, and it's critical to your faithfulness. It is so important to physically, and so I know people watch online, and you online folks, welcome, we're glad you're here, but it's always better in person. It really is. You can smell the hay, you can see the lambs, and whatever strange creature is up there. It's always better in person. And so I get that. I mean, I watch the service online when we're traveling and all that, but you need to rub shoulders with other believers. Iron sharpens iron, okay? And so at the beginning of the series, God asked Jeremiah this question. He said, if racing against mere men makes you tired, how will you race against the horses? Now, this is not a slap down by God to Jeremiah. It's actually an invitation to a life that's rich and full with meaning, to walk with the Lord. And as we've walked through this story of Jeremiah, of running with the horses, we looked at his life. One of the things that I've noticed is kind of surprising is it's not an invitation to do something, supernatural or extraordinary. It's really about just ordinary faithfulness. It's really just about listening to the Lord and walking faithfully with him. And so Jeremiah, he does that. Now, Jeremiah never led a revival. He never packed out a stadium. He was never popular. Everyone hated him, except his buddy. He led Melech, whatever his name was. Anyway, that guy, right? The Ethiopian, right? Jeremiah, he spent much of his life misunderstood, rejected, and opposed, yet God calls him a hero, you see. And so it's kind of like in that horse race that we opened with, the Kentucky Derby, you got Golden Tempo, and he's at the back of the crowd. And everybody in the stands is like, look at that horse in the back. What's he going to do? And yet he comes and he wins the race. And I feel like that's so many times how the world looks at Christians. Look at them. They give away their money to church and to to charities. And they give up their Sundays to serve the Lord or to worship. Like, I'm playing golf my tee-off time's 9, that kind of thing. We have people who have given up a week of vacation to serve in VBS because it means that much to them. And the world looks at that and they're like, what are you doing that for? Christians often look like last place to the world. But in the eyes of the Lord, and those are the only eyes that matter, we're going to win the race. We're going to win the race. Actually, we could say this: if you're in Jesus, you've already won. And so, faithfulness matters. God never asks us to keep up with the crowd. He asks us to keep in step with Him. The crowd is loud. The pressure to compromise is real. The culture is constantly trying to shape us into believing what they believe. But the ancient command is still true. Jesus is Lord. The gospel is still the power of God to save. And faithfulness is still worth it. Run with the horses. Run with the horses.
Thank you for joining us today. If you feel like God spoke to you today and you would like to discuss your next right step with God, please visit cornerstonechatham.org, scroll to the bottom of the homepage, and fill out the form to connect with us. We hope you enjoyed being with us today, and we look forward to seeing how God is working around Cornerstone in person and online.